Good morning, everyone. I hope and pray that you're fine wherever you are. I am okay, and Nairobi, from where I live, is fine. Now, it is over 1 year since the war in Ukraine began. Russia invaded Ukraine several months ago, and as we speak now, thousands have died, and millions have been displaced from their homes. Owing to this fact, people and global citizens, including me, have been told that Russia invaded a sovereign nation unprovokingly. I accept this fact and I acknowledge this fact, but I did some assessments on the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine and the developments before this war started. And in my assessments, I tend to believe, and I must make a conclusion, that the key perpetrators of this war are the United States and NATO, and not the Russian President Putin. I did some deep assessments on the ongoing war and the happenings before this war started. And I found that Vladimir Putin, engaged the Ukraine President Zelensky in 2019. These two presidents met to resolve their disputes. They met to resolve their differences in France. And among the arguments that were on the table were the same arguments that are on the table currently. I assessed the discussions between Putin and Zelensky in 2019, and I found that these two individuals discussed, among others, the Minsk agreement which was signed in 2015. If you are well aware of the facts surrounding the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, you will find that the Minsk Treaty or Minsk Agreement is one of the contentions. Now, these two presidents discussed, among others, the Minsk Agreement. They also talked about the need for Ukraine to change its constitution and the sovereignty of two Russian territories in eastern Ukraine. In 2019, Putin engaged Zelensky to try and sort out their differences. And I believe that Putin did a very good thing. He never resorted to war at the first time. What Putin did, to me, aligns with the theatrics of just war theory. You know, just war theory requires that before invading any country, before invading a sovereign nation, you must use war as a last resort. Using war as a last resort means that you have explored all the alternatives. You have explored all the measures for assuming peace. You have attempted to settle the differences without engaging in war. I believe that what Putin and Zelensky did in 2019 was an attempt to sort out their differences before using war as a last resort. Before Putin invaded Ukraine, he also engaged Zelensky for the second time, and I don't know for the third time, to try and sort out their differences. And during this time, one of the key issues surrounding the conflict between Russia and Ukraine was the desire by Ukraine to join NATO. Over the years, Russia, let me say, Russia neighbors have opted to join NATO. You remember Finland joined NATO. Finland is just bordering Russia. Sweden, which borders Finland, also applied to join NATO. And to some extent, Putin was against Ukraine joining NATO because he believed by Ukraine joining NATO, that was posing serious security bottlenecks, security threats to Russia. And I believe Putin engaged the Ukrainian president Zelensky to try and convince him not to join NATO. Amid all these arguments, the United States and other NATO members to some extent accepted Ukraine's request to join NATO. I want you to understand that NATO or the United States accepting Ukraine to join their alliance, to me, does not hold water. This is an attempt by the United States and NATO to sabotage Russia. For those who study history, for those who read history books, you will understand that the war between Russia and United States has been existing since the end of World War II. The two superpowers fought during the Cold War, and the two superpowers fiercely engaged one another in control of Europe. Now, the United States and NATO accepted Ukraine's membership to sabotage Russia. And in this way, I believe the United States and NATO overstepped. They overstepped their roles in ensuring peace. They overstepped their roles in maintaining the sovereignty of other nations. I checked on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and the developments and the involvement of the United States and NATO. And I found that, you remember I said that Putin tried to solve the differences with Ukraine out of war. He tried to solve the current differences before invading Ukraine. And currently, the United States and NATO members are in the front line supporting this war. Why am I saying that United States and NATO are in the front line supporting this war? I found in a recent article that was published by the BBC, noting that, just assessing the amount of weapons and troops that the US and NATO intend to send to Ukraine, I found that the United States is intending to supply Ukraine with missiles. In addition, it intends to supply Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets. At the same time, the United States is supplying Ukraine with the 31 Abrams tanks. Apart from the United States, the UK, United Kingdom, I found that sent 14 Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. Germany and other NATO members sent Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. I also noted that there was a proposal for NATO members to mobilize about 300,000 troops, which were to be ready in 30 days. Where are they heading to? Ukraine, to fight in Ukraine. I also noted that NATO has instructed its members to update their military stockpile, and spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. All these developments are being done by NATO members, led by the United States, because I believe the United States has overriding control in NATO. If you check these developments, the United States and NATO are pushing Ukraine into a war which Ukraine cannot win. I don't say that Ukraine is not fit militarily, but I believe that compare Ukraine with Russia, Ukraine is no match to Russia. And the United States are in the front line. NATO members are in the front line, pushing Ukraine to fight. They are pushing Ukraine to fight. Who are the victims of these developments? The victims of these developments are innocent Ukraine civilians, innocent families living in Ukraine, innocent children living in Ukraine, innocent women living in Ukraine, and innocent men living in Ukraine. The United States, I believe, and NATO are contributing to the rising death toll in Ukraine. They are pushing Ukraine to fight. They are not pushing Ukraine and Russia to mediate their differences, of which I believe the first option in this engagement should be settling the differences between Russia and Ukraine without war. The first option, the priority in the ongoing conflict, is the United States and NATO members to engage Russia and Ukraine to try and sort out their differences without engaging in a war. I believe it is not too late. It is never late. Putin tried to sort out these differences before engaging in war. And the United States and NATO pushed Ukraine, accepted Ukraine membership just to hang Putin. In these perspectives, I believe, and I must argue strongly, that instead of blaming Russia, instead of blaming the Russian president Vladimir Putin, the blame should be directed to the United States and NATO members. Because instead of solving the differences between Russia and Ukraine without war, these members, these individuals, these parties, these sovereign nations are supplying weapons. They are supplying weapons to Ukraine to make sure that this war is endless. With these developments, I must confess that more innocent civilians will die, and more innocent civilians will be displaced from their homes, and Ukraine will cease to exist if the developments, the injections by the United States and NATO members goes on. I believe that the United Nations is not working. The United Nations has left as, let me say that it has delegated its duties to the United States and NATO. NATO and the United States are currently the players purporting to maintain world peace and security. But instead of maintaining world peace and security, the United States and NATO are fueling war. They are contributing to the death of innocent civilians. You remember, when you check the history of the United States and NATO, they have erred in so many countries. The United States and NATO erred in the first Gulf War, when they invaded Iraq between 1990 and 1991. The same United States and NATO erred in Libya, when they invaded Libya and their president Muammar Gaddafi because of claims of harboring weapons of mass destruction. And if you read history, you will find that the claims by United States and NATO that Muammar Gaddafi was harboring weapons of mass destruction was untrue. Even as we speak, Libyans are still fighting, and the United States and NATO were there in the name of maintaining peace and security. Iraq, people are still fighting in Iraq. The United States and NATO were there in the name of maintaining peace and security. The same will happen to Ukraine if the Ukrainian president is not sober enough. The United States and NATO are pushing Ukraine to fight, and the result, the outcome of this fight will be Ukraine ceasing to exist, lawlessness in Ukraine, and endless fights in Ukraine. Russia will be Russia even after the war. But Ukraine, in my view, will cease to exist. At this point, I must emphasize that the United Nations must act. The United Nations must deliver on its mandate of maintaining peace and security. Currently, I see a silent, a dormant United Nations. The United Nations Security Council must act very swiftly. And if the war between Russia and Ukraine must end, then United States and NATO must stop supplying weapons to Ukraine and try and sort out the differences between Russia and Ukraine without war. I checked and I found that Russia and their president, Putin, presented solid arguments to the table. He presented valid arguments to the table, explaining why he invaded Ukraine. And one of the convincing arguments was the need to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. I must accept that Ukraine is a sovereign nation and it is free to join NATO. But strategically, Ukraine joining NATO poses a significant security threat to Russia. If Ukraine joins NATO, then it will mean that Russia is surrounded by NATO. Putin is just trying to protect Russia and Russians. And I believe that if the United States and NATO mean well for Ukrainians, if they mean well for world peace, then they should listen. And I say listen to the arguments that the president of Russia presents. They must listen and, if possible, revoke Ukraine's pending membership to NATO. And in doing this, I request and I implore the United Nations through the Security Council to engage the Russian president and Ukrainian president, because they are the two parties involved in this war. They should be engaged and their differences sorted out amicably. I task the United Nations. I don't task the United States or NATO, because United States and NATO are known for war, meaning they cannot solve the differences between Russia and Ukraine outside war. The only organ, the only institution that can solve the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine is the United Nations. I comprehend and I applaud the efforts that African leaders undertook, I don't know, sometimes last month, when they visited the president of Ukraine and president of Russia to try and sort out their differences. I applaud them for such efforts. The same should be replicated in the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council should take active efforts, active measures to ensure that the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky are engaged in open discussions and their concerns listened to. And until then, innocent civilians will still die under the watch of the United States and NATO. I encourage the Ukrainian President Zelensky to be sober. I want to encourage him to be sober. Fighting this war is not a matter of winning or losing. Fighting this war is not it does not mean the number of Russian soldiers killed. In this war, there is no meaning in calculating the number of Russian missiles exploded. Fighting this war does not mean or does not relate in any way to the number of Russian tanks destroyed. This war boils down to the innocent Ukrainian civilians. It boils down to innocent Ukrainian families. It boils down to the innocent Ukrainian civil servants. The United States and NATO are encouraging Zelensky to fight at the expense of the life of innocent Ukrainians. Millions will continue to die, and thousands will die. The victims will not be the United States, and the victims will not be NATO members. The primary victim in this war is Ukraine. And so long as you, Zelensky, continue requesting for more military support from NATO and United States, more will die. I encourage Zelensky to sober up, and I encourage the United Nations to try and sort out the differences between Russia and Ukraine. Thank you, and God bless you.